The snowman's head toppled backward, landing in the slush with a muffled thud. Kenji Yamato lowered the wooden shovel slowly, his breath fogging the bitter December air. Around him, silence stretched across the camp like fresh snow untouched by footprints. Even the guards, leaning lazily by the fence, didn't speak. The act wasn't violent, but it carried the weight of rebellion. The snowman, built awkwardly by American soldiers in the middle of the parade ground, had stood just 2 hours before with a crooked smile and a half-buried carrot nose. Now, its decapitated body sagged like a soldier at attention too long in the cold. Koji Nakahara, standing beside the barracks doorway, exhaled sharply through his nose. "They think this is culture?" he said in Japanese, his voice dripping with dry contempt. Laughter rippled among the men gathered near the mess hall, the sound tight and brittle from mouths unaccustomed to mirth. Koji stepped forward, boots crunching the snow, and surveyed the flattened face at his feet. The lump of coal used for an eye had rolled several feet away, stopping near a patch of trampled boot prints. "A child's game," he added, brushing snow from the cuff of his coat, "and they paraded in front of us like some monument to victory." His voice was calm, but his shoulders were stiff, and his gaze flicked briefly toward the watchtower. The sentry didn't move. The guards rarely did unless instructed. That's what made this worse, not the snowman itself, but the emptiness around it. As if this had been allowed not by kindness, but by apathy. Private Ichiro Makabe snorted behind him. "You think this is kindness?" he said. "This is insult wrapped in ice." Koji didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Yamato. Kenji had returned to his corner of the yard, leaning the shovel against the chain-link fence. He wasn't grinning. He wasn't angry either. Just still, expression unreadable. His gloves, tattered at the seams, hung limp at his sides. It was Commandant Blackwell who'd issued the directive. Encourage seasonal recreation. Something to lift morale ahead of the holidays. But most of the American guards saw it as unnecessary. One sergeant was overheard grumbling that it was a fool's way to dress up a cage. The prisoners didn't know what to make of it. Some suspected a trick. Others, like Koji, saw it as a deliberate attempt to mock their isolation. Childish figures of snow offered in place of dignity. No one told them to participate. But no one stopped the guards from building them either. That morning, a corporal from the quartermaster's office, barely 20 and chewing gum as if to stay warm, had clumsily stacked 3 snowballs in front of the laundry shed. He'd added twigs for arms, a spare button for an eye, and a gnarled carrot that looked as though it had already passed through someone's soup. It leaned slightly to one side, an absurd grin drawn across its packed face. A crude joke. A clown made of ice. Koji had watched it take shape from the corner of his bunkroom window. He'd said nothing, just stared. Not because it angered him, at least, not at first, but because he didn't understand it. Americans seemed to laugh when things got cold, as if joy could ward off war, as if humor was armor. Back home, in Kyoto, winter was quiet, measured. Snow meant closing shutters, layering socks, brewing tea. It meant silence, not spectacle. He remembered his father once sculpting lanterns from ice along the garden path, delicate, balanced, shaped by hand and melted by dawn. Not this, not the crude thing melting in front of him now. And yet the absurdity had power. It felt like being offered a balloon at a funeral. Koji folded his arms. "You did it to mock us," he called out, not to any man in particular, but loud enough for all nearby to hear. Kenji Yamato turned his head. His face remained passive. "No," he said simply. "I did it because it didn't belong." Koji raised an eyebrow. "The snowman?" Yamato nodded once. "It smiled," he said, "when nothing else does." For a long time, the wind carried no reply. Snow settled in thin sheets over the ruined figure, powdering the cracked carrot and coal. The men dispersed slowly, some muttering, others shaking their heads. Inside the barracks that night, Koji lay awake, eyes on the ceiling beams above. The laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by the faint rhythm of boots crunching outside, guards on rotation. Somewhere, a stove hissed faintly. He couldn't stop thinking about the snowman's face, not when it stood, but after it fell. Blank, empty, forgotten. He thought of Yamato's words. It smiled when nothing else does. Perhaps it was a joke, or perhaps it wasn't. But whatever it was, no one tried to rebuild it. In the morning, frost sealed over the shattered pieces, and no one spoke of it again. Mockery was safer than memory, and snow never remembered a face. The static didn't stop. Petty Officer Roy Halberd gritted his teeth as he adjusted the frequency dial on the USS Ransom's primary receiver. The sound that came through wasn't a voice, wasn't code, just the relentless hiss of snow. It filled the narrow radio cabin like ghost breath, faint but constant. His knuckles were pale as he leaned in closer, one ear pressed to the monitor, his other hand reaching up to wipe a thin layer of condensation from the sonar screen for the 6th time in the past hour. "Still nothing," came the voice of Lieutenant Mason Farrell from behind. Roy didn't turn around. If nothing has a temperature and a rhythm, then sure, still nothing. The air inside the submarine was thick. Not from smoke, though the engine room often spilled the scent of grease into the passageways, but from pressure, emotional, physical, mechanical. The crew hadn't surfaced in over 96 hours. Outside, the North Pacific swelled cold and deep. Somewhere off the coast of the Aleutians, the submarine was locked in a listening mission. Listening for imperial chatter. Listening for movement. But all they were getting was snow. Farrell stepped beside Roy and peered over his shoulder. The young officer's face looked worn, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. "We've already logged it. Probably just ionospheric interference," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Roy sat back in the chair with a soft exhale, fingers unconsciously tapping the cold metal casing. "It started right after Sitka. Before that, we were getting clean bounce-backs. Now, it's like we're underwater in more ways than one." He paused, his voice dropped. "Or like someone's jamming us." Farrell frowned, unconvinced. "Nobody knows we're here." "We're in a designated neutral corridor." The brass triple-checked that Roy glanced sideways at him. "The brass also said we'd be resupplied 4 days ago. We're eating green bananas and scraping mold off bread that silenced Farrell." A low rumble passed through the hull, a groan that felt like the ship itself was exhaling under stress. Somewhere in the aft compartment, a valve released with a hiss. A crew member cursed softly. One of the electricians had been filing a report about malfunctioning ballast sensors. Another mentioned drops in oxygen quality. But none of it was mission critical, according to the central dispatch. Surveillance, not repair. Watch, don't worry. Listen, don't think. Roy returned to his instruments. He adjusted the narrow band filter. The static shifted briefly, then returned, louder. The irony was cruel. Snow outside the submarine would mean death. But inside, snow came through the radio. Soft, mechanical, endless. It whispered without meaning, and it never stopped. He thought of home, of the cornfields of Omaha, now probably blanketed in early snow, of his father's hand-built barn, of the sound snow made when it fell on a tin roof. Peaceful snow. Not like this. Suddenly, a sharp screech pierced the channel, a spike of interference. Roy flinched and adjusted the gain. "Hold on," he muttered. "That wasn't static." Farrell leaned closer. It came again, a pattern. Short, long, short. Not quite Morse, but deliberate. Almost like switching bands, Roy said quickly. His fingers moved with the precision of habit, his breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. A pause. Then, nothing. Silence. But not the comforting kind. The absence of noise in a submarine is not peace, it's suspense. Maybe it's an echo, Farrell offered, but it sounded weak. Roy tapped the casing. Or maybe it's not an echo at all. Maybe someone's broadcasting something we're not supposed to hear. Before Farrell could respond, the engine suddenly choked. A mechanical cough rippled through the floor. Then everything stopped. Fans, pressure hum, auxiliary buzz. The silence was absolute. A red light blinked to life above the control panel. Emergency shutdown. Seconds later, the intercom crackled. Control to radio, report status, engine stall confirmed, repeat, report status. Roy grabbed the mic. Radio here, static still ongoing, no actionable signal, possible interference, engine failure could be related. A pause. Then, maintain position. Do not surface unless ordered. Repeat, hold your depth. Roy lowered the mic. They want us to sit in a dead zone with no engine, no signal, and a ghost in the wire. Farrell's face had turned pale. We're in a neutral corridor, he repeated, but the words were hollow now. The crew gathered quietly in compartments, murmuring. No one shouted. There was no panic, just fear, drawn tight like thread across a needle. The cook in the galley sat motionless, spoon mid-air. The navigator folded his maps again and again, as if erasing their location would change their fate. Someone coughed. The air was getting thin. Roy didn't leave the radio room. He kept listening. The snow kept hissing. He pressed the headphones tighter to his ears, eyes closed. No more patterns. Just the same, constant noise. He thought of something his brother once said before heading to the front in Europe. You can always tell when something's gone wrong. Even the air stops pretending. Outside the hull, miles of cold water pressed in. Above them, silence. Behind them, interference. And ahead, no one knew. Roy looked up. The monitor screen shimmered with static, white and shifting like snow on a field. He whispered to himself, barely audible. Sometimes, the loudest screams are made of snow and static. The shovel scraped the ground with a hollow rasp. Sergeant Charles Doran winced at the sound, not because of its sharpness, but because of the silence that followed it. He glanced nervously at the group of Japanese POWs standing in a loose half-circle around the equipment shed. None had moved to pick up the tools he'd laid out on the frost-covered ground. Their expressions were blank, some amused, some resentful, most unreadable. It's optional, Doran added, clearing his throat. But it might be a good way to stretch your legs. Build something. No one responded. Private Koji Nakahara stood near the back, arms crossed tightly over his gray issue coat. His eyes lingered on the shovels, then flicked toward the guard tower behind Doran. He shook his head and muttered something in Japanese, just loud enough for a few around him to chuckle. Doran forced a weak smile and looked down, pretending to adjust his glove. Recreation detail, Commandant Blackwell had said. Build rapport. Humanize the atmosphere Doran had agreed on paper. But here, face to face with a wall of frost-bitten stairs, it felt like tossing snowballs at a glacier. The prisoners began to disperse, uninterested. Doran stepped aside, letting them pass. He told himself he wasn't disappointed. Koji turned to follow the others but paused. Through the gap between the barracks, just past the old mess hall chimney, someone was moving alone. Slowly, deliberately. He narrowed his eyes. Private Kenji Yamato was scooping snow with bare hands, shaping it into a small, uneven mound against the red brick wall. His movements were methodical, his back hunched with the focus of someone performing a ritual rather than recreation. No one else noticed him. Koji hesitated, then turned off the path and made his way toward him. You missed the joke, Koji said in Japanese when he was within earshot. Yamato didn't look up. It's not a joke. Koji stood in silence for a moment. The cold bit through his boots. You're making another one? Yamato nodded once. His hands were red from the cold, and the knuckles of his right hand were scraped. "I thought you hated the first one." "I did," Yamato said quietly. He finally looked up, meeting Koji's eyes with something sharper than defiance, grief. "But I've been thinking about my brother." Koji blinked. "You never mentioned a brother?" Yamato gave a small, humorless laugh. "He died in Siberia. Frostbite, starvation, whatever name you give it. The snow took him. When I saw them laughing and posing next to that crooked snowman, I wanted to bury my fist in something." Koji looked down at the misshapen pile of snow. "And now you're... what? Rebuilding it?" "No," Yamato said. "I'm giving the snow something to remember." "This isn't for them." He stood and brushed snow from his knees, revealing the early shape of a torso, packed firm and smoothed with deliberate care. Koji stared at it, his breath fogging in front of him. Something in Yamato's posture had changed. The bitterness was still there, but quieter, contained. "I hated them for laughing," Yamato said again. "But snow remembers pain, too." For reasons he couldn't explain, Koji stepped forward. He crouched and picked up a lump of snow, kneading it in his palm. "Then let's make it symmetrical," he said. "Your brother would have wanted it to look right." Yamato gave a single nod. They didn't speak for a long while after that. Over the next hour they worked in tandem, using hands, canteen cups, and whatever flat surfaces they could find. Yamato handled the proportions with practiced muscle memory. Koji focused on detail, carving the lines of the face with his fingernail and shaping the shoulders with the edge of a boot heel. The snowman grew slowly. Not childish, not grotesque, but solemn. A little taller than either of them, it stood with a faint forward lean, as if bowing under the weight of silence. A few guards drifted by, slowing as they passed. None interfered. One leaned against the side of a hut, arms crossed, watching with unreadable eyes. Koji stepped back, brushing snow off his sleeves. "It needs a name." Yamato paused, then whispered, "Jiyuu." Koji glanced at him. "Freedom." "For him," Yamato said, "and maybe for us." It was nearly dusk when they finished. The snowman stood near the mess hall wall, backlit by the amber sky. A few prisoners passing by stopped and stared. No one laughed this time. From his office window, Commandant Blackwell saw the figure and called for his aide. "Was that authorized?" he asked. The aide shrugged. "No reports, sir." "Just a snowman." Blackwell stared at the shape in the distance for a long time before turning away. That night, in one of the barracks, a junior officer recorded in his leather-bound journal. "They named it Jiyuu, freedom, and I don't know if it was for us or them. Some men chisel statues from stone, others carve forgiveness from snow." The shutters snapped before Corporal Everett Miles fully realized what he had captured. Snow had begun falling again that morning at Camp Larkfield, a slow, steady descent that blurred the barbed wire fences and softened the angular lines of the guard towers. Everett, bundled in an oversized army parka and gripping a government-issued Kodak Medalist camera, scanned the yard through fogged lenses. He was tired. The journey up the mountain roads had frozen the gears of his truck. His boots were stiff with slush. He was supposed to be photographing scenes of morale, seasonal joy among the enemy, to prove that the American way, even in captivity, offered dignity. Instead, through the frosted lens, he saw two men standing silently beside a snowman. Koji Nakahara and Kenji Yamato stood like sentinels, unmoving, each resting a gloved hand on the snowman's sloped shoulders. The snow figure had no lopsided smile today. Its face had been shaped with careful hands, smooth lines, a straight carrot nose, button eyes aligned. There was an air of mourning in the stillness, a kind of reverence Everett hadn't seen in any of the staged snowball fights or laughter for camera scenes he had been forced to orchestrate over the past week. He lifted the camera, focused, and took one frame. Just one. The sound echoed louder than expected, like a small crack of ice splitting. Yamato's eyes flicked toward the sound but said nothing. Koji didn't move. They knew they'd been seen. Everett lowered the camera slowly. He wanted to say something, perhaps to thank them or to explain, but the words froze in his throat. He stepped back, muttered a quiet, "Sorry," and turned away before he could embarrass himself further. Inside the administrative barracks, warmth and noise collided. A radio blared Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Lieutenant Bannister, Everett's direct superior, lounged with his boots up, flipping through last week's morale photos. "Any gold today, Miles?" Bannister asked without looking up. "Mostly routine." "One. Might be something," Everett replied, slipping the exposed film into his coat pocket rather than the official canister. His voice was tight, distracted. "You sound like you saw a ghost," Bannister chuckled, lighting a cigarette. "Don't overthink it. These men are just actors now. Don't forget that Everett said nothing. That one frame, Koji, Yamato, Jiyuu, kept burning into his mind like the afterimage of a flashbulb. There had been no posing, no performance. It wasn't propaganda. It was something else." That night, under the weak bulb above his cot, Everett developed the film himself in the backroom darkroom set up for the morale team. The image slowly emerged through the chemical bath. He stared at it for a long time. Their expressions were unreadable, neutral, somber. The snowman stood like a third figure of grief, shoulders hunched as if from weight rather than shape. There was no joy in the photograph. But there was something more valuable: truth. Everett didn't submit it. He kept the print in a separate envelope and labeled it only Camp December. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to protect the image. Maybe to protect the men. But 1 week later, while reorganizing prints for the quarterly morale newsletter, Lieutenant Bannister grabbed a stack from Everett's desk. "Need filler. Chaplain's writing something about winter unity or whatever. Got anything snowy?" Everett reached forward instinctively. "Wait, those aren't approved." But Bannister had already pulled the photograph from the envelope. He held it up, frowning. Subdued. Actually looks kinda noble." He shrugged. "Fine. Could use a quiet image. All the snowball ones are blurry anyway." And that was it. The photo went in. 2 weeks later, across the country, in a POW processing station near Tucson, Arizona, the image landed on a desk thick with manila folders and hand-scrawled ledgers. A Japanese officer, Colonel Matsuda, reviewing Red Cross circulars and American newsletters for cultural intelligence, paused when his eye caught the snowman. He studied the image closely. His pencil paused mid-sentence. 2 Japanese soldiers. A snowman with a carrot nose. Western eyes might see it as harmless. He saw something else. "What is this?" he muttered aloud, drawing the attention of another officer. "They're building Western icons now." He circled the image in red ink and scribbled in the margins in clipped kanji. "Explain this." The photo was passed up the chain and eventually made its way to a Tokyo-controlled oversight committee. Though the Red Cross issued a neutral response, seasonal recreational activity encouraged for all POWs, internal U.S. military channels buzzed with quiet panic. Camp Larkfield had already been flagged once for over-humanization. Now it was being accused of moral drift. The next day, back at Camp Larkfield, the snowman was gone. It hadn't melted. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing that week. It hadn't fallen either. There were no footprints, no wind trails, but its head was found at the edge of the barracks, crushed as if stomped underfoot. A carrot lay nearby, cracked in half. Yamato said nothing when he saw it. He returned quietly to his bunk. Koji stood for a long time in the yard, staring at the broken base where Jiyuu had once stood. His breath formed clouds in the morning chill. When Sergeant Doran walked past, he paused, uncertain whether to say anything. "I'm sorry," Doran offered finally gently. Koji didn't look at him. "Snow melts," he said simply. But Everett Miles knew better. He stood in the darkroom again that night, staring at the same image, now printed cleanly, carefully, tucked into a thin envelope. He would not keep it this time. He wrote no caption, signed no name, but folded it into a letter addressed to his uncle in Washington, a man working quietly in the War Department's archiving division. Just in case someone tried to make the image disappear completely. Photographs capture truth, but they can also frame disobedience. The bundle tumbled from the crate with a dull thud. Technical Sergeant Emery Vicks froze, halfway through dragging a box of bent mess tins across the concrete floor. Something about the way it landed, heavy, soaked, oddly shaped, felt wrong. The contents shifted inside, a wet, dragging sound muffled by canvas. He stood up slowly, brushing grime from his sleeves. Around him, the depot was alive with motion. The low drone of the ceiling heater, clanks of wrenches against rusted bolts, murmured German chatter from a group of reformed POWs uncrating winter gear at the far end. Emery narrowed his eyes and stepped forward. The side of the bundle had a faded stencil. Winter disposal. Larkfield. He called out to the corporal who had just hopped off the back of the army transport truck. "Hey," Emery said, nudging the soggy bundle with the tip of his boot. "What is this?" The corporal glanced over, wiping road dust from his sleeves. "Just camp trash. Old wreck stuff. Might be snow mold in there." Careful Emery raised an eyebrow. "Trash? From a POW camp?" The corporal's shoulders stiffened, his boots crunching on scattered ice melt as he turned back to secure the truck's tailgate. "Orders are to burn it or break it down for salvage." "Don't overthink it, Sergeant." But Emery was already crouching. The canvas was damp, fraying at the seams and tied with a loop of comm wire. He pulled it loose. A carrot fell out and rolled gently across the floor. Emery stared. Not a raw vegetable. This was hardened, shrunken, its surface discolored, frostbitten. The kind a child might press into a snowman. His hands moved faster now, pulling back layers of fabric until he uncovered black buttons sewn into patches of wet cloth, broken twigs that once served as arms, and scraps of snow-soaked fabric the color of mess hall uniforms. At the bottom of the bundle was slush, grimy, half-melted, tinged with coal soot, and embedded deep within it, barely visible, a photograph folded in plastic. 2 Japanese men standing beside a snowman. Emery inhaled sharply. He had seen this photo before. Weeks earlier, it had appeared in a morale newsletter, tucked between recipes and holiday poems. A harmless filler image, supposedly. But Emery remembered the uneasy feeling it gave him. The photograph was unlike the others. It wasn't staged. The men weren't smiling. The snowman between them wasn't comical. It looked like a memorial, or a grave marker. He stood up, canvas still in hand, as the overhead lights buzzed softly above him. The depot suddenly felt colder, despite the heat coils overhead. "Where's the burn pile?" he asked the corporal. "Furnace is back corner," the man replied without looking up. "We cycle it after hours." Everything from Larkfield's going in first. Emery nodded slowly, then slung the bundle over his shoulder. That night, after the rest of the crew had left for chow, Emery stayed behind under the pretense of clearing inventory. He waited until the lights dimmed and the depot quieted. In the back corner, past rusted stoves and broken tent frames, stood the furnace, a massive iron chamber, relic of an earlier era, still fed with coal and roaring with heat when lit. But tonight, Emery didn't light it to burn. He closed the main door and opened the inspection hatch instead. With care, he laid the bundle down beside the unit. Then he pulled a folding chair from the wall and sat. The radio on the workbench crackled faintly with evening broadcasts. Somewhere, swing music hummed over the static. But Emery didn't listen. He was busy. He peeled back the cloth again and retrieved the damaged carrot. He took a rag and began gently cleaning it, running his fingers along its grooves as if it were glass. The button eyes, still attached to a strip of soaked fabric, were next. One was chipped. He dabbed it with industrial glue from his locker, hands trembling slightly. It wasn't repair, it was remembrance. He didn't know the names of the men, but something about the snowman, about the care someone took to crush it, bury it in snow, call it trash, told him it mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. He worked in silence, drying what he could near the furnace's heat, careful not to scorch the cloth. Hours passed unnoticed. By midnight, the pieces were laid out on brown wrapping paper. He placed them gently into a small box. Cloth, twigs, buttons, carrot, and the photo, dried and flattened beneath a wrench on the bench, now nestled on top. He wrapped it in canvas and tied it with cord. The chaplain's name came to him without effort, Reverend Carl Hensley, assistant spiritual liaison to Camp Larkfield. He had signed off on surplus Bibles once. Quiet man, kept a drawer full of bookmarks and wax-sealed envelopes. Emery didn't sign the parcel. He left no note. Just the box, wrapped in quiet. The next morning, it went out with the depot's courier run. No one asked, no one noticed. Back at the furnace, the inspection hatch was still open, letting the cold air in. Emery stood there a moment longer, staring at the iron belly of the machine, then shut it firmly. He never spoke of what he'd done. And years later, when the drawer was opened in a dusty chaplain's archive, no one would know how close that bundle had come to disappearing in flame. You don't need to understand a symbol to feel when it's being erased. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in January 1971, dropped through the mail slot of Reverend Carl Hensley's modest brick home with a soft clatter that barely stirred the cat sleeping near the radiator. The morning was quiet, snow muffling the world outside like a thick woolen curtain. Hensley bent down to pick up the envelope, frowning at the unfamiliar handwriting. It was yellowed slightly at the edges, bearing a War Department watermark barely visible beneath layers of time. A red stamp marked it, property of Chaplaincy Archives. He opened it slowly. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in brittle tissue paper and a folded photograph. As he peeled it open, two black button eyes slid into his palm, cold and smooth. A shriveled, leathery object followed, what looked like a dried carrot, stiff and splintered. He unfolded the photo last. Two Japanese men stood beside a snowman, their expressions solemn, hands resting gently on the snowman's shoulders. Hensley stared at it for a long time. His breath caught. "Koji," he whispered, and "Yamato." He hadn't spoken their names aloud in over 2 decades. The photo trembled slightly in his hand as memories surged back, days of bitter cold, muffled orders, small rebellions carried out in silence. He sat down at his desk, laying the photo under the brass lamp. The light pooled across it, revealing every smudge, every crease. He remembered the snowman. He remembered when it was built, when it stood like a quiet monument behind the mess hall. They had named it Jiyuu, freedom, not in defiance, but in mourning, and maybe in hope. The snowman had lasted 4 days before its head was found crushed, carrot nose buried in the slush. No one had confessed, but everyone had known what it meant. He closed his eyes. At the time, he was a young assistant chaplain, still unsure whether mercy belonged in a uniform. Orders came down fast that week. Limit unsupervised gatherings, discourage cultural blending. The guards called the snowman a distraction. The senior officers called it a problem. Hensley had wanted to speak out but hadn't. He'd stayed silent. Now, 26 years later, silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like cowardice in slow decay. That afternoon, he drove through the newly paved municipal airfield that had swallowed what was once Camp Larkfield. A small plaque stood near the fence. Site of WE Internment Camp, 1943 to 1945. No names, no stories. That night, Hensley stood before his senior history class at the local high school. Young boys, mostly. Boys who had never tasted war, only heard about it in documentaries and textbooks. The projector screen behind him showed slides of ration books and war bond posters. He didn't mention the envelope. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Today, we're going to talk about memory. Not history, memory. The kind that doesn't end when a war does." He held up the photograph without preamble. The class leaned forward. "This is from a POW camp that used to stand 5 miles from here," he said. "These 2 men were artists. Soldiers, yes, but also brothers, sons, men who had nothing left but the snow under their feet and the silence of men who didn't know how to reach them." He paused. "One of them lost his brother in the Siberian snows. The other mocked the snowman, until he helped rebuild it. They called it Jiyuu, freedom. They weren't mocking us. They were remembering themselves." He let the silence sit like snowfall. A student in the back raised his hand. Hensley nodded. "What happened to them?" the boy asked. The question struck harder than expected. Hensley looked down at the photo, at the hollow eyes of the snowman, at the hands resting gently on its shoulders. His mouth opened, then closed again. He saw again the burning of the mess hall stove, the way the carrot nose was placed carefully in the drawer, the way no one ever spoke of it after. He lifted his gaze to the boy and answered slowly. "Some were repatriated," he said, voice low. "Some vanished, but one still visits every time it snows. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of humanity, reconciliation, and the small moments that melt away division. Its purpose is to entertain, while reminding viewers that even in the coldest times, compassion and understanding can warm the heart."